Okay, so I'm Austin, and this is my third video in the series on why I love Infinite Jest. So most of the things that I think are really good about this book don't start coming into play until maybe a little bit over 300 pages in. But something that I've noticed on this read through as I've been thinking about the things that I want to say later on is, sort of how much legwork it does to establish some of the ideas that become very important later. That, I didn't really notice until I started reading it through this time, thinking about all the things that I want to talk about later. And, an example of this is, a pretty important idea that I'm probably going to spend a good amount of time on in videos after this one is the idea that something that makes AA something that makes Alcoholics Anonymous a unique institution in our society is that, unlike most other things, AA can only exist if it works, right? If it didn't work, then you couldn't have an AA meeting because there would be no sober people to be sitting around talking, right? The only way that you can have a group that all its constituents are people who've been sober for some amount of time is if there is a system that allows people to attain and maintain sobriety. If it didn't work, it would just be a bunch of, alcoholics at a bar complaining about whatever. So AA can only exist if it works. As opposed to, most of the other things in our society their existence depends on convincing other people that it has value. Convincing the society as a whole that it has value. And, in order to convince other people that either you or your job or your organization or whatever do have value, you don't necessarily have to be successful in any way in order to say, I have some kind of value. And I think, this difference is something, AA can only exist if it works. Other things can only exist if they convince other people that they're valuable. I think this is a very important distinction in this book. It's one of the things that on this read through that I've started to realize that, a lot of the legwork that's sort of necessary to establish this idea is done much earlier in the book than I originally realized. And sort of specific to the example of most things can only exist if they convince other people that, they're worth something is Dr. Rusk, who's the, staff psychologist at ETA. And, she's someone who she has a job that she's paid to do and she goes there. But, she doesn't have to be successful at what she does. In fact, there's many things to suggest that she isn't very good at what she does, and it seems to be widely understood that she isn't. Most of them later on in the books are kind of, have some humor associated with it. But I think one of the most important examples of her lack of success is something that happens very early on in the book where, Hal is sort of in an observational way, it's discussed how Avril is worried about, Hal's, whenever Hal goes and drinks with his friends, how she's worried about that because of how his dad was an alcoholic and how his dad's dad was an alcoholic, and his mom is worried that that's going to pass on to him, that Avril is going to, Avril is worried that the alcoholism is going to pass on to Hal. So anytime he drinks with friends, she gets worried. And, one of the things that's in there is that, Dolores Rusk, Dr. Rusk, the psychologist on staff, she like convinces, or I don't know if she convinces, but at the very least she says to Hal's mom that, no one could have the academic and athletic success that Hal has while also abusing substances, right? His very success at ETA is evidence that he doesn't have a problem. Sort of this idea that substance abuse and success are, that they can't coexist. They're mutually exclusive. And this is something that's just not true. And so, this is an example of, Rusk just sort of not being very good at the thing that she gets paid to do, the sort of her job and why it exists. But, once again, in many things in our society, you don't have to be successful to exist, for your job to be there and for you able to keep that job and not get fired or anything. You don't have to be successful. You just have to convince other people you have value. And, you could say sort of in a simple sense that, she's able to convince, Avril and Charles that she has value, maybe just through some level of deceit that, they don't really understand her field. So she can trick them into sort of, believing that she knows what she's talking about. But there's even another way to look at this where even Charles can look at the headmaster of ETA. He can look at Rusk and know that she doesn't do her job well, but still believe she has value, right? Because one, it says in the book that, in this fictional world, having a staff psychologist at a tennis academy is a requirement for accreditation. So even if Charles knows that, she's not good at her job, he can still see that she has value because she checks that box and allows him to say that his school is accredited. He can also see that she has value because when he has brochures or advertising spiels to get students to come to the school, he can tell their parents, oh, we have a staff psychologist. And them having never met her, don't know whether or not she's good at what she does, that could give them reassurance. And so, this is sort of me rambling to say that, Rusk could be bad at her job and just trick people into believing it, which is a way that her job can continue to exist without being successful. But then also, even the people around her can know that she's not good at her job, but still believe she has value in an indirect way. And so, the fact that Dr. Rusk is able to keep her job as long as she is, this goes very completely against the idea of AA presented in this book, which is that it can only exist if it works. And, I think this distinction is very important. And like I said, I'll talk about it later, but I just want to say something that I've appreciated about this book on this read through more because I've been thinking about talking about it later, or thinking about the things I'm going to talk about later, is, I've appreciated how much genuine legwork is done in the first, 1 to 200 pages, that this is something I really didn't pick up on before. But anyways, that's this video.